name is Diana, and I'm here representing Commissioner Steve.
Anyone else? Okay.
Lori, thank you for representing
Thank you. We also want to recognize those folks from East County. So who is from East County? Who represents East County? How about our social service providers? Any housing specialists in the room? Great, thank you. And last but not least, just citizens, just here that you've heard about the meetings and you wanted to come and share your ideas and concerns. Thank you all for being here. Please eat all the food, drink all the coffee. If you do that, we'll definitely have a nice conversation, interaction, and interchange. Bathrooms in the back. And with that, I will hand the mic over to Tim.
Thank you, Regina. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. It's going to be a very short presentation, and we're going to ask for your feedback on what our community needs, especially around housing and community economic development. For some of you who are not familiar with what the annual action plan is, it's something that we do every year, and it's a way for us to hear from the community about how we should be spending our federal dollars. Every year, our federal government sends us about $11 to $14 million that goes through the Portland Housing Bureau of the City of Portland to our partners in Multnomah County, Gresham, and the City of Portland. And we use those funds for housing development, for social services related to housing, for homeownership, and housing rehab and redevelopment, just to name a few of the things that we use that money for. Every year, however, circumstances change. We have a plan, a 5-year plan for how we plan to use that money, but we know that circumstances keep changing every year, and so we come back to the community on an annual basis, and the federal government asks us to do this, to find out what is changing, where we need to be spending our money in the future, and we'll be asking you more about that shortly. What else do you need to know about the planning process? The folks here at the table are part of your federal funding oversight committee. They represent Multnomah County, Gresham, and the City of Portland, and they're here to hear from the public about our housing needs. We meet on several times a year, so this is the needs hearing. Following the needs hearing will be what we call the action plan hearing. This typically happens after we've already put in place our budget for Multnomah County, Portland, and Gresham. And then what we will present to the community at that time are specifics about how we plan to spend those federal dollars. And then again, we ask for feedback from the community. Are we spending this the right way? Is this what you intended? And does this follow the needs that you outlined in the fall? At your to the tables, when you break up into small groups, you'll see a market study about the housing need in Multnomah County, and it's there for your information. There's also some maps here on the wall and at your tables that help describe what the housing needs are in terms of someone's household income and what's affordable to them in Multnomah County. So there's just some resources available to you to help give us some feedback. Also at this table, there are some consolidated plans from previous years and the 5-year plan. And again, we want you to use those for your information. So that's just the background on the consolidated planning process. If you have any questions, feel free to come up to me. I'm going to pass the mic on to Tracy Manning, the Director of the Portland Housing Bureau.
Thank you so much for so many people coming out for the full day. Really appreciate your giving your input. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we use that input. So as Kim said, needs change every year, and certainly we all know that we have a very serious lack of housing affordable to people that live here, that is accessible to good transportation and jobs. But there's a lot more detail behind that, and those of you that work in the community, that part of the community can help fill in those details, particularly about those conditions that do change year to year. So we'll really be looking for some specifics from you, your experience, the experience of your community. So as an example, last year, the top themes that emerged,
Mark J.
of course,
Hoffman,
need for
Jr.
more affordable
You care?
housing. But
Out here,
specifically
Rosewood Cafe.
that as a community, we continue to value permanent supportive housing
This
as
is
a
the,
way to meet the needs of
Federal
people
Funding
who
Oversight
have,
Committee.
a
Got
need for extra
Mark from
support,
Join and multiple others.
to try and retain their housing over
From Multnomah County,
transitional
Gresham,
housing,
and Portland.
situations. But additionally, we heard again some refinements and detail to that the needs of women in our community who are homeless or pretty marginally housed were on the upswing, unfortunately, and that some transitional services were needed in that arena, particularly for folks experiencing domestic violence. Certainly, along those same lines, we've heard from you that we need more case management, mental health services, and jobs. And then in particular, a lot of feedback about the fact that people from communities of color are still overrepresented in poverty and homelessness in our community, and that services that are culturally appropriate for people are really effective, and we need to be a part of all of the services that all of us are providing. So what we did with that information, and sort of moving on to what we're going to do this year. So the City of Portland starts our budget process pretty early, and because of the good work that Kim and her colleagues have done, this needs hearing is aligned with the very beginning of our budget process. Shortly after we start ours, Multnomah County, City of Gresham, and the City of Gresham will start theirs. So you're informing the early stages of our budget process. City of Portland's budget, this needs hearing is technically just about our federal funds, but we budget our federal funds along together with city general funds. So we're really hearing you about how we spend all of that money. So last year we used some of the feedback that we heard here to set our criteria. Unfortunately, we were in a pretty severe cut year last year. We had to produce a budget that had 10% less money in it. And so we used some of what we heard here today to set criteria very particularly around equity. And so we tried to look at things we were proposing to cut, as well as things we were proposing to keep, specifically in what impact they had on communities of color, and whether that impact was disproportionately impacting people from those communities. The other thing we heard a lot about was that the organizations that deliver services couldn't sustain. We want to try to keep them whole, assuming that the budget picture would bounce back. We wanted to not overly damage them for the long term to take care of hopefully what would be a short-term cut. So the good news here is City of Portland is probably not looking at a cut budget this year for the general fund. The mayor has said that I do not have to submit a budget showing cuts to city general fund services. Then there's the federal funds, which is what we're primarily here to talk about. Anybody here want to name with Congress? Congress, anyone? No? Okay. So that's going to be a little bit more of a struggle. We believe today that we will not have to ask for a 10% cut in our federal budget. We will probably look at a minor cut in our federal budget. But to be honest with you, I don't really know. Congress has a deadline coming up that they've set for themselves in mid-December about creating the budget for the coming year. We'll know a little bit more then. But for right now, it's at least probably not a 10% cut to my budget. These things affect different people differently, so you can't extrapolate that, and something crazy could still happen. That's the plan today. We'll try to keep folks informed as we hear more. So thank you again. I know it took a lot of time. I appreciate it, and please do stay and leave comments. Gloria.
there are 10 cards at various locations that can let you know kind of what that table topic is going to be. If it's not in the couch area, if you can share with you. We're trying to keep it 8 to 10 people at each table. You feel free to go to all the tables at different points and make comments or look at information. And we'll probably do that for 45 minutes, I think. So take about 5 to 10 minutes to stretch or get some more refreshments and then we should take table.
I'll do that, everybody. Before you get up, we have the 5 minutes worth of announcements, and I'm also going to give you some additional instruction about what's going to happen at the table. City staff, Multnomah County, and Gresham staff will be at each of the tables. The topic areas are rescue housing, homelessness prevention, home ownership, short-term shelter, economic opportunity, City of Gresham infrastructure development, City of Gresham economic opportunity, and Multnomah County infrastructure. The 2 topics about Gresham will be at that set of couches over there, and we'll combine those 2. I'm going to kind of tell you some of the geography where things are. Homeownership is going to be a small table. Rental housing will be here. Short-term shelter and homelessness prevention will be at the couches back here. Multnomah County will be somewhere behind the pole, and then Gresham again will be back at those couches in the back. If I forgot anything, please come up to me. Facilitators, please come to me because I have some additional instructions for you. And so, thank you for your attention. Now we'll have a few announcements. Ryan, do you have an announcement?
Hello, my name is Ryan Begley. Housing Bureau Management Schemes. I just wanted to share with everyone, we appreciate you coming out on a cold day today. I just wanted to announce that as of tonight, the City of Portland has declared a severe weather event, which we do throughout the winter. As part of our ongoing, we have both year-round and winter shelter beds that are available throughout the community. On nights when the weather is particularly life-threatening, we open additional shelter beds through a partnership with the American Red Cross. And so those shelter beds will be open initially tonight. If you need more information about available shelter beds throughout the community, both during severe weather and on any given night, your best source of information is always 211 info, and you can reach them either by going
That poor chair wasn't gonna survive very
very the development. Because now they've been shifted to another area where it's under developed now. North Portland is one of the areas with highest opportunity. And people are still not, these residents don't know and starting to partake. So I'm wondering if we're going to
to put in the record all the cases.
well, access to employment, I think, is a very big issue.
So it's pretty good.
That even started many communities, they don't have many opportunities. And perhaps bring soils and big things of that nature to make sure that that is, you know,
sort of chicken in the egg. You gotta have the sidewalk and you can you gotta start someplace. You can't necessarily do what you want. But we may be able to do something on the sidewalk. They don't need
recently, I think in like 2008, where the state really community gardens there, and they started testing all of the caves and really mentioned the lead content in that made it in. And I noticed that a lot of people I live on the interstate who are living there currently and the road, I can't, I see such a things that are necessary. So making sure
where people know that they're getting safe information. I'm glad to hear that the Grange is still alive and well. Sure, it was something that made them money. So let's go to a lab. Somebody's going to have to make a lab.
Well, the people might say that.
You guys done with your conversation?
No, I haven't.
Okay, Joel, you're going to talk about
Alright, so we addressed some things for the homeless shelters issue over there. I was over there in the short-term shelter part, and basically, it made some effect. I explained how we're, on the stepping up from the streets to indoors, we're missing the step in between, which is the short-term shelters, which is it's like having a step up to a deck or a second floor, and falling through because you're missing that step. So, and people have a tendency to jump the step and slip and fall back through anyways. So if we built that step, which is the transitional housing and shelter, then we could have the ability to get more people off the streets more rapidly, more fluently, and have security in the fact that they'll actually want to stay up here, because it's like a transition, and it's like a comfortability level raising and etc. like that, so that because not everybody's gonna be shell shocked, or a lot of, I'm sorry, not everybody, but a good amount of people will be shell shocked if they're just thrown into housing and are so used to the streets. Now, if they were able to step up once to the shelter and then be able to go into housing after that, and where all the organizations know where they're at the shelter, at least then they can all show them, hey, this is service available, and etc. So, but they're going to make some announcements.
Another topic, please do so. And then if you see a group that's especially big and other folks aren't being heard, you also might want to move to another group just so that you can be heard and so everybody else has a little more room at the table. Thank you.
And then they are having to pay with the program. way back. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so I'm gonna go out and have a break, but we'll be back to check up on you guys.
You're very quiet.
I'll let you do the group before we get. So you just was, all right, Keith, get back on.
Rosa Cafe was kind enough to let me use their Wi-Fi and their Wi-Fi and their table and amenities to be able to broadcast this event. So pretty happy to say that we have this opportunity. Glad to see it. I stress the shelter issue, step up shelter issue. And mind you, this is federal funding, and they're just trying to figure out from the community how to use it. It's good that they're actually asking the community. And there was plenty of notice for people to know that this is going to happen, and I got invited by joining myself. This group that you're seeing right before you is the Multnomah County Infrastructure. The Federal Funding Oversight Committee. So all this is Federal Funding Oversight Committee. So when it comes down to it, when I go into Stiff Fall and I need somebody to come take my place, when it comes to being here and doing these things, I'll make sure I hyperlink how to get involved, guys. All right. Again, this is Mark J. Hoffman, Jr. with UCare. So I'll show you. Kind of shaky. There you go. These are the items that they're doing, their sort of priorities, 2014, 2015. It involves, number one, there's different groups. One's rental housing, the other one's homelessness prevention, the other one's home ownership, another one is short-term shelter, which is the biggest thing we've been pushing for because we're lacking that most of all out of anything. Economic opportunity, which is a good thing. I need to go jump in that group to see what's going on. City of Gresham infrastructure development as well. Then there's the City of Gresham economic opportunities. Number 8 is Multnomah County infrastructure, which is the one right here in front of me. But there you guys go. More information about the annual action plan and to comment, visit worldwideweb.portland.gov/P-H-V/51008. It looks like there's a period there for some reason, which I don't know. All right?
Ella dijo que se llevaron
I'm just following on Twitter the fact that Mayor Hale just got rid of
Let me read it to you guys here.
Keep her recording.
All right.
No problem.
Hi, I just wanted to give a quick announcement. Before
I'll say
you
after the
leave,
announcement.
please fill out the comment card if you're interested and leave them at the front table. There will also be opportunities to comment online. You can email us, send us a letter, give us a call if you didn't get an opportunity to say we wanted to say today. And then please also grab what food you can on your way home. And thank you for coming out. We're going to keep the facilitators will remain at the tables for another half an hour. Thank you.
Yep. All right, so, says, Charlie Hills fires City Finance Director Jack Graham after controversy at Finance Department. So yeah. I guess this is after him using city funding to employ his own people at his own business. And tell me there ain't corruption around here? Oh wait, forgot, there is. And this is the reason we have UCare and all the other organizations, but UCare keeps up on that for you guys, for all you guys. Mind you, I'll be gone for about a month and a half here shortly. I gotta take a brief vacation at DePaul. Not because I'm using, but because I need to get into housing. Still 6 months sober. Woo! Doing good. Thanks to all you guys and all your support. It helps me out too, guys. Just letting you guys know, and I want to give you guys a shout out. I love y'all.
Yeah, just in case it works, man. Yeah, no problem, dude. You know what I mean? But it was like I want to broadcast it now. So much, man. I appreciate it. I'll be seeing you around. Yeah.
We just feed all of the stuff. We did all of it.
If you get a chance, check out the page. I can actually write something. Right on. You got a pen on you right now? Yeah. Here. Blowing up faster and like I was pointing out, like, I love it. Portland is great on everything else. Keep it sustainable. Sustainable North Shore. Build up that shore. Build that up. We have that. That's one step up. You know what I mean? Because that's, like I said, there's a step missing here. We have that. It's easier to transition to and they don't have they have the land. They just don't make it kind of explain jobs, scenario transportation, and kind of explain the boundaries where what areas are needing what they're lacking what, etc. It's kind of dying out right now, but it doesn't mean it's over. Still a lot of communication needs to happen.
with my broadcast. I just got to talk to Mark. We had a conversation about housing, etc. But he has some very good valid points. Well, I may not agree with all of them because still missing that gap. But the way he would kind of explain that, he's trying to work on balancing out, and there are a lot of people that won't make it in shelters and that would make it straight into housing and do better. But so I'm working with it, trying to figure out, kind of tailor with that and take that information into consideration and possibly maybe mold a little bit more about that. And if it doesn't fit, then obviously it doesn't fit the model, because what I see is different than what he sees, because I'm actually out there on the streets and I can see a major difference in what really is needed versus what I can think is needed and what I assume could be needed. Or, he sees more on the monetary side, whereas I see more of the actual necessity side. And so, as long as we can get something addressed regardless, a lot of people are pushing for the same thing I was, as far as the housing, even if it's just winter or temporary or open for 6 months out of the year instead of all year, it'd be better than nothing. But the thing about it, regardless, what about the other 6 months? What? We just get beat up by the cops again still? No, that's not right. And so we just got to get that figured out regardless, and because if we can't, if he's only putting 700 people total, it's not 700 people a year, it's 700 people total or something like that. There's a little difference between that and 3,000 people a year that are out there on the streets on any given night. And that's not just summer, that's during the winter, 8,000 plus people. So we'll have to figure that out somehow and come to a conclusion. All right, guys. Mark and Jay, I'll find some details. See you guys.
Yeah.